Now we're going to be recorded. Okay. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share the screen. I'm going to try to put the chat up so I can see it. And if you have questions, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions in the middle. Also, I'll stop and take questions at various inflection points during the share. Okay. So here is the here's the Makarat set. Okay. So we're going to start by setting up a series of Gemaras which talk about the category Shaat Hadchak. We'll start. I'm going to switch us back all the way to page 1. I'm sorry. Sorry if this is dizzying for the moment. Here we go. Okay, so the Gemara in Sukkah. This is one of the cases that we're going to be staying with. Gemara in Sukkah says the following. There are four minim on Sukkot. You all know about that. And you can't add to them or subtract them. That's not our issue. If you don't find an estrog, this is our issue. You can't bring something from another species. You can't bring a pomegranate instead of an estrog, as you that right. If they're withered, kimushin, then they're kosher. But if they're dried out, here's our real case. If they're dried out, then they're puzzle, right? You're not yotzei the mitzvah of the four minim if you take a dried out something. Rabbi Yehuda says afyavation. Rabbi Yehuda says that even dried out ones are kosher. And now Rabbi Yehuda adds something. He says maaseh bivnei krachin or karchom, different girsot, people of a particular city, shehayu marishin ulavein livnei v'neihen. They used to bequeath their lulavs to their grandchildren. Okay, lulav bequeathed to your grandchild is likely to be very, very dry. Amrlo, so the rabbi said to him, Misham Raya, what kind of proof is that? Ein Sh'as Hadchak Raya. You can't bring proofs from situations of pressure. So we don't know what the pressure the Bnei Krachin were under, but the most likely pressure they're under is that it was impossible to get fresh lulavim. Maybe it was impossible even to get one fresh lulav for the whole city. So they had no other realistic capacity. It could be that it was possible, but only at enormous expense. We don't know. But there was some circumstance which made it extremely difficult to get a non-dried out lulav, even a non-exceedingly dried out lulav. And Rabbi Yehuda says, look, they used to do this. And the rabbis don't say, or the people who ever respond to Rabbi Yehuda don't say, no, they didn't used to do this. They say, you're right, they used to do that, but that's a shas hadchak. And you can't prove what the halakhah is in a non-shat hadchak circumstance from a shat hadchak circumstance. Okay, but that's going to be a little problematic because it says that they're pasul. So either it's a kosher lulav or it's a pasul lulav. Why should a shat hadchak change the nature of lulav from kosher to pasul? Okay, that's our underlying question. And we have to figure out, what does Rabbi Yehuda think? Right? Does Rabbi Yehuda have a principal position? No, a shat hadchak is a proof. Otherwise, that's why he cited it. Or does he have a disagreement about the specific circumstance? Does he think, no, that wasn't actually a shat hadchak? Okay, right. Those are underlying questions. I brought you two other cases. One is about roofing a sukkah with boards that are four tefachim wide. And there again, right, there's a rabbinic decree against doing that because it feels too much like a roof. And here again, Rabbi Yehuda says, look, right, once upon a time when it was dangerous, they did that. Why it was dangerous to make a sukkah in a particular way is not clear. And they said to him, no, it was dangerous. That's no proof. Okay, everybody says, obviously it can't be a pikuach nefesh situation per se, because then obviously you do anything you do to save your life. It must be a circumstance either where it wasn't really that dangerous, it was just a little bit dangerous, or that it was dangerous to build a sukkah, but the question was, is this a sukkah or not? Right? Rabbi Yehuda says, look, they did that, and the response to him might have been, okay, but it wasn't a sukkah. They just did something as right. Okay, right, we'll go back to that. There's a third case. Rabbi Yehuda says the same thing about bringing things through various places that would be asur d'Rabbanan. The issue about both these cases is that both these cases are obviously rabbinic, whereas the invalidity of a dried out lulav on the surface may at least be, and probably is, a biblical issue. I brought the other two cases, even though they're less dramatic, to show you that this is just a pattern. It might be a position of Rabbi Yehuda, that Rabbi Yehuda always thinks that shas hadchak is a proof, and the rabbis don't. But there are other cases. I could bring you other cases from Tosefta where Rabbi Yehuda does this as well. But we'll see. It's not only Rabbi Yehuda, so it's not clear that it's a particular ideological position. Okay, I can show you that, for example, that it spreads into the anonymous section of the Yerushalmi. Here's a case where really fascinating case. It's own right where Rabbi Zira says to Rabbi Chananel, you're not right. You're never allowed to read scripture orally. And then they quote a story where Rabbi Meir wrote a Megillah by heart, and the response is Ein lamedin mishas Hadchak. Okay, right. So the Yerushalmi seems to state this as a as an accepted principle that you can't derive halacha from Shas Hadchak. On the other hand, that's the answer, but the questioner assumed otherwise. So this dialogue between Rabbi Yehuda and the sages plays over, and then we get to the text that is really going to primarily occupy us. Here's the text. Okay, so Tanya, we learned in a Breita that Amar Lem Rabbi Eliezer the Chachamim. So background you have to know about this is there's debate between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim about women who are presumptively premenopausal, who missed 3 consecutive expected periods, and then the question is if they then later bleed, right? At what point do you have to presume that they started bleeding for the purpose of taharot? Rabbi Eliezer says you assume that they were tahorot until the moment that they start bleeding. And the Chachamim say you have to go back 24 hours. So Rabbi Eliezer says to the Chachamim, Maaseh b'riba achat, there's a story about a particular young woman, Behetlo, that's a place, Shehefsika shalosh onot, right, she missed 3 periods, Uva maaseh lifnei Chachamim v'amru dayashata. And the story came to Chachamim, and they said, we presume that she was tahora until this moment, against the position that is articulated by the Chachamim in opposition to Rabbi Eliezer, which is that you have to go back 24 hours. Amrulo, so they said to Rabbi Eliezer, Ein Shas Hadchak raya. Okay, same dollars Rabbi Eliezer, you can't bring proof from a Shas Hadchak. But here the Gemara does something useful for us. The Gemara says, Mai Shas Hadchak. What's the definition of a pressure time? So the Gemara gives 2 answers, which do not at all seem to be the same thing. The first answer is Shnei Batzoret Havu. There was a famine, and so and if we declared the food that this young woman worked with to be tamei, then there is a certain number of people who will not be able to eat it. If it was truma, then it becomes inedible to everybody. Right, so there's a time of scarcity, and this psak was affected by the necessity to preserve the food. But some people say no, it's not about this. It's not about the time of scarcity. It's just about the amount of stuff. Right? Tares afish lavida the chasher rabbanon lehef taros. It's not because it was a time of scarcity. It's just that she was in whatever way we would call her. She was a super spreader. That that in some way she affected the tara of a great deal of material, and because she affected the tara of a great deal of material, therefore they felt compelled to respond. Okay, so now we have a boundary of what's called a Shat Hadchak. For the purposes of whether Halakhah changes, a Shat Hadchak means either there's a generalized famine, or it means that there's something about this specific circumstance that motivates us to think that the ordinary Halakhah should not apply. And the Chachamim said Rabbi Eliezer, just because we said that she was tahora in that case, doesn't mean that you can say that this is the general halacha. Then the Gemara goes on. The Gemara says, Tan Rabbanan, we have another Breita. Maaseh aviasar Rebbe Rabbi Eliezer. So now we're several generations later. Rabbi Yehuda Nafsi is confronted with a case, and he rules like Rabbi Eliezer against the Chachamim, that the woman is tahora up until presumed tahora up until the last moment. The achar sheniskar, but after he remembers, we don't know what he remembers. Amar kedayu Rabbi Eliezer lismoch alav b'shas hadchak. He says, "Oh, Rabbi Eliezer is sufficient to rely on in an extreme circumstance." Okay, so the Gemara says, "Ma'ila achar sheniskar." What is it that he's remembering? If you're going to say it's after he remembers, oh, I thought the halacha was like Rabbi Eliezer, but really it's not. Really the halacha follows the Rabbanan. So if the halacha, the Gemara says, if the halacha is really not like Rabbi Eliezer, so what does Shas Hadchak change anything? So this seems to challenge the whole presumption. The halacha is or isn't, and the Shas Hadchak can't change the halacha. Ella, rather the Gemara comes with a fascinating notion. Lo idmar hilchot v'lo kimar v'lo kimar, that we're talking about a case where the halacha is in flux. It's in a, I call it, it's in a liminal or a quantum state where it hasn't actually been decided. Because remember, we're mechanical decisors, right? So we don't have any of our own opinions at this stage about the meaning of the text, right? So we're dealing with the case. What we know is that there are multiple authoritative opinions, and there has never been an authoritative decision about it. Right? So what does he remember? After he remembered that Rabbi Eliezer was a minority position, so he said, so what did he say? What? So it sounds like what he said is, I shouldn't have paskin that way. But then he says, but it's okay that I paskin that way because it's a Shas Hadchak. So there's a really ambiguity, right? Because if it's really a Shas Hadchak, maybe, right, he should have paskin that way. So it could be, and the way most people read it is that it's not really a regret. It's that Rebbe made this psak thinking it was an ordinary psak, and then he said, "Oh my goodness, I was wrong," and then he said, "No, I wasn't wrong because in a Shas Hadchak, that's really how you should paskin." Okay, so now we have right. So now we have two different circumstances. One circumstance is Rabbi Eliezer bringing a proof that the Chachamim of an earlier time behaved, or of his memory, behaved in accordance with his position, and they say to him, "You're making an inappropriate generalization." We agree that in a Shas Hadchak, that's the halacha, but that doesn't tell us the halacha in ordinary circumstance. Then we have one stage later, where after this argument between Rabbi Eliezer and the Chachamim has already taken place, and now we know that everyone agrees about a Shas Hadchak, but they dispute in the ordinary circumstance. Rebbe has a circumstance where he thinks it's ordinary, and then he says, and then in the end, when he realizes that he was wrong about it being ordinary, but he's also wrong about it, or at least he thought it was an ordinary psak, and he realizes, no, it wasn't. I was ruling like a minority position. He says minority positions are fine in a Shaat Hadchak. So the issue we're going to have to address immediately is, are the boundaries here, right, in the first case? In the first case, what we're saying is there's universal agreement that in a Shaat Hadchak you should behave one way, but there's a question of whether you can extend that. And here, we're not talking about universal agreement. Here, what we're saying is there's an argument, but you're allowed to rely on the minority position in a Shas Hadchak. So are the rules the same? Right? Is really what we're saying is, one way to read it is that Rabbi Eliezer's position is, right, the minority position here at least is that is agreed by everybody to be the position b'Shas Hadchak. That doesn't seem to be the real nature of the story. The nature of the story seems to be that there's an argument. There's a difference between saying there's universal position and saying that right here it sounds like Rebbe thinks that the Chachamim would argue even in a Shas Hadchak, but he thinks he's allowed to reject the Chachamim in a Shas Hadchak. So really, there are two kinds of cases. One case where everybody agrees what the halacha is in a Shas Hadchak, that's the first half, and a second case where there's a dispute even in a Shas Hadchak, but because of the Shas Hadchak, you can rely on the minority position. So this ambiguity is a machloket between Rashi and Tosfot. Here's how Tosfot expresses it. All right, Tosfot says, "Lismoch alav b'Shas Hadchak." That's the second case. So Pirush Bekuntrus, Dishnas Batzoretz Hava v'Ike Hefser Taros. So this is Tosfos and Aaron, but it's talking about a quotation of our Gemara. So Tosfot says, Rashi says that the circumstances under which you can rely on a minority position are the same as the circumstances in the first case, where basically everybody agrees. So it sounds like Rashi is saying that really relying on a minority position is really something like a claim that there really is no argument about that case. Everyone would think you should rely on a minority position in that case. But that's, that really should depend on how extreme the argument is. Tosfos rejects this. Tosfos says, "V'yesh shalom arkein." You can't say that. Because in circumstances like the first half, afilu rabbanan modim, the rabbis agree, because that's the meaning of the phrase "Ein Shas Hadchak Raya." You can't bring proof from that. We agree it happened. We agree with Halakhah in that circumstance. We just think that's no regular proof. Okay, and the Gemara there says, right? That defines the Shnas Hadchak as a batzoret, or as too many things to do. Okay, so Tosfos says we have to really set up two different categories of Shas Hadchak. There's the kind of Shas Hadchak where everybody agrees what the Halakhah is. The only discussions we have about whether this is that kind of Shas Hadchak. And then there's the kind of Shas Hadchak where no, right? There's an argument what the Halakhah is, but you, as a second level decisor, are allowed to rely on a minority position. And Tosfos says that is a lower standard, right? Right. There's a standard of Shas Hadchak where everyone agrees, right? That has to be a very high standard of Shas Hadchak, and that standard is defined as famine or extremely expensive circumstances. But then there are other circumstances where, you know what, no, people still argue, but in those lesser circumstances, you can rely on minority opinions. And Tosfos tells you what those lesser circumstances are with a very close reading of the Gemara. Right? He says, well, what's the Shas Hadchak? So he comes up with a clever idea. The Shas Hadchak that Rebbe is thinking about when Rebbe says, Kedaihu Rebbe Eliezer lismoch Shas Hadchak la'achar nisheniskar, is a Shas Hadchak created by his earlier psak. So Tosfos says there are two examples of what that Shas Hadchak is. One possibility is, this is his last line, Shas Hadchak shashoel halachlo ve'atarach gadol erdof acharav. It just means Rebbe Paskin, the person left, and now Rebbe would have to track after that person. Abraham Lincoln story, right? Tracing the person down, right, many miles away. So Rebbe says, look, do I need to go ride my horse for 6 hours to track down this person and tell him I made the wrong psak? No. It's a Shas Hadchak for me. And because the Shas Hadchak for me, all right, therefore I can leave the psak as it stands. That's a much lower standard than a famine. The second possibility Gemara says, which is more relevant, is, you know what it is talking about where Rebbe paskined this, and before he paskined it, the woman or whoever came in contact with her had not, in fact, made much food tameh, but because of his psak, now lots of things have become tameh. So the Shas Hadchak is the effect caused by his taros, and whether the issue is it's also the economic loss, or whether the issue is the embarrassment caused by correcting a psak that has had such circumstances, is not clear. So probably the second. So Rebbe has Rebbe says that really that the standard in which you can rely on a shitat yachid post facto is if it causes difficulty for the posek. That doesn't tell us very much though about what the standard for a posek is relying on a shitat yachid in advance. Right, so we might really say there are three kinds of Shas Hadchak. There's the kind of Shas Hadchak where really everybody should agree, right? And that's not relying on minority opinion. That's just saying this is the Halakhah in a Shas Hadchak. Then there's a Shas Hadchak when you can rely on a minority case. That really has two kinds of cases. One is where you already made the decision, and now the question is, do you have to correct it? That Tosfos gives us standards for. And then there's a situation which might matter most to us, which is where I have a circumstance that's not quite the same thing as a famine. It's not this huge economic loss, but it's not an ordinary circumstance. Am I allowed to rely on minority opinions there or not? Okay, how does this play out? So moving to page 2, the Ramah quotes a list of rules about Shas Hadchak. Sorry for that. Okay. The Ramah. So here are the Ramah's rules. The Ramah says, if we're talking about Horat Iser Veheter, which is our case, right? We're dealing with the ritual law, not with adversarial law in court. Hudvar Iser Deraisa. We're talking about Deraisa. So Ramah says there are rules. Right? Ordinarily, if you have no opinion of your own about the meaning of the text, and there is no authoritative decision, so if it's a Deraita, then you follow the strict opinion, and if it's the Derabanan, then you follow the lenient opinion. Okay, I keep doing that. I'm sorry. I don't think the chat is working, so I'll stop and take questions soon. Here's what Tosfos says: "V'dafka in beta cholkin heim shavin." Right. This all these rules apply only if the argument is between people of equal authority. Aval ein somchen al divrei katan neged divrei gadol imenu b'chachma v'minyan afilu b'shas hadchak. Now Tosfos says even in a Shas Hadchak, you can't rely on a minor figure as opposed to a major figure. Gadol imenu b'chachma v'minyan, let's say, means wisdom and number of students, although it could also mean age. But It's wisdom and public influence, right? Public halachic influence. So you can't rely on a minor figure against a greater figure. Afilu b'shas hadchak, ela im kein haya gam kein hefsid meruba. Right. So Tosis, so the Ramah seems to rule, as we'll see, sort of like Rashi, that the standards of Shas Hadchak are the same. And then he says, right, he says, right, he says, in this Shas Hadchak, you can only rely on a katan negative gadol menu if there are two circumstances. It has to be a Shas Hadchak, which also involves great loss. Right, you can't rely on an individual against the Rabim unless you meet these rules, which are Gadol Mina B'Chachma Minyan, which are Shas Hadchak and Hefsed Meruba. So it sounds like our standard for relying on minority opinions, according to the Ramah, which is the same as Rashi, is right, and he seems to apply this even not just post facto, but even in circumstances going forward. You can only rely either on minority opinions or on the opinions of less influential figures if you meet this standard called Hefsed Merubah, and Hefsed Merubah is greater than Shas Hadchak. Okay. He puts in additional rule that'll be important to us later, that all this applies only if the greater party or the multiple have heard the minority opinion, but if they're not aware of the minority opinion, the rules don't apply. That's not my issue. Okay. The Bach then comes along, and the Bach says, there are really three kinds of Shas Hadchak. Echad, Shas Hadchak greda sheyesh bahefsed mu'at. There's a regular Shas Hadchak. There's some kind of pressure on you, but the loss is minor. Uvimot tachol adam benoni. Right, and this is right. So this is on an ordinary weekday for an ordinary person, because Shabbat can sometimes be called Shas Hadchak, as we'll see, right? Because even wealthy people, we'll see in a moment, can be considered poor if they won't have any food for Shabbos. But we're on a regular weekday, and somebody comes with a kashrus shaila, which is going to cause them to throw out something which isn't terribly important. I don't know, a container of cottage cheese, whatever it may be. So that's what we call a regular Shas Hadchak. Okay. Then he says, Sheni, Shas Hadchak sheyesh bahefsid merubah kimashmao. Right? There's a Shas Hadchak where there's an objectively great loss, and then he says applies a fil ashir. It's not a relative category. They're just telling you, look and say, wow, that would be a terrible waste. Okay, so if a rich person comes to you, right, and their entire, right, the question involves their entire meat supply for the next 2 weeks, and you look at it and you say, okay, you know what, for this rich person, the meat supply for 2 weeks is not a big deal financially, but it's a lot of stuff. Right? You can set up what your boundary is, that that where you can say that even for a rich person, this is not trivial. For the world, it's not trivial. Okay, then he has this, right, a third category. It says, Shlishi Shas Hadchak sheyesh bahefsed mu'at. There's a Shas Hadchak that has an objectively small loss. V'chashuv ki'ilo haya hefsed meruba, but we consider it as if it's a great loss. V'hainu, okay, that means a circumstance like this. The Kamar Kigon, Lani bimot chol, right? So a poor person during the week, so he's because the person is poor. So any loss is important. Ole ashir b'Shabbat v'Yom Tov she'efshar lachin acher. Right? Havinami Shas Hadchak. Right? There's also a Shas Hadchak for a rich person who doesn't have an alternative for Shabbos. Right? That's considered as if it's a hefsid merubah for a rich person during the week. Okay, and he thinks that this is what we call the equivalent for a rich person. For the rich person's food just before Shabbos is like everybody's food during a famine. Right? That's the chashud hefsid merubah lefi hazman. So there's a subjective standard of great hefsid merubah. Okay, and then he says there's also, right, hefsid merubah in terms of a person's objective circumstance. But now he adds something new. He says aval pikatan neged gadol. He says, right, all this is about the rules for relying on minority opinions as opposed to relying on less influential figures or less great figures. Aval pikatan neged gadol. He says, but we're talking about relying on minor figures against greater figures. Ein somchen alakatan lakel b'Shas Hadchak sheyesh bahefsid meruba. That, he says, really against the Ramah, you can't rely on that ever. Right? He says you're never allowed to rely, because of Shas Hadchak circumstances, on lesser figures against greater figures. Certainly, if you're dealing not with objective hesed meruba, but only with subjective hesed meruba, and he tells you explicitly this is against Harav Bago Shulchan Aruch. This is against the Ramah, who thinks that the rules for the din katol katan keneged gadol shavel din yachid keneged rabim, right, which is the same as the Ramah thinks the rules for relying on less influential opinions is the same as relying on minority opinions. The less he thinks that's wrong, Ella could depreciate. Rather, the truth is as I have said. Okay, so let's stop for a moment. I'm going to summarize, and then we'll take questions. Really, there are three potential kinds of ways in which Halakhah can change b'shas Hadchak. There can be a circumstance where the argument is there's universal agreement that this is the Halakhah. Once we agree that it's a Shas Hadchak, everybody agrees this is the Halakhah. Then there's a second situation, which is we say it's a Shas Hadchak, and therefore I can rely on minority opinions against majority opinions. Everyone agrees that in a situation of Hefsed Merubah, you're allowed to rely on minority opinions as opposed to majority opinions. And the third question is, can I rely not on minority against majority, but on minor as opposed to major? There, the Ramah says that in Hefsed Merubah, you're allowed to rely on, right, it's following Rashi, that in Hefsed Merubah, you're allowed to actually, let's leave Rashi out of it. Relying on, the Ramah says, in Hefsed Merubah, you're allowed to rely on minor opinions, not just on minority opinions. And the Bach says, no, you can't rely, you can never rely in a Shas Hadchak on minor opinions. The only time, right, all a Shas Hadchak can change is either reliance on minority opinions or a claim that here's a circumstance where there's no argument at all, because everyone agrees this is the Halakhah b'Shas Hadchak. Okay, so I'm going to stop for a moment, and this would be a good time to ask questions if anyone has any. Okay, I guess I'm going to assume that was pellucid. So I'll go back to sharing.
Can I answer the question?
Yes, sure.
Okay, so in a situation in which it's time of abundance, certain questionable food items are going to be ruled as not kosher.
Right.
But in a situation in which food is not abundant,
Mm-hmm.
what we're saying here is that you can be more lenient, not go totally against halacha, but be more lenient or rely on more lenient opinions to make sure that everybody has enough. Is that right?
Yeah, but it depends. Like I said, it depends on lenient opinions. So we sort of dispute whether those lenient opinions are minority opinions and how severe the issue is. If it's a really severe issue, then it's not relying on lenient opinions. Everyone thinks in those lenient opinions it should be fine. And if it's a less severe situation, so then the Ramah would say you can rely on minority or minor opinions if they're lenient, and the Bach would say no, only minority opinions. You can't take positions that are stated by minor figures, even if lots of minor figures hold them. All right, that's the criteria we're setting out. Okay.
Wait, I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, Jerry.
I may have missed this. I was not in the beginning. But is there never a Shas Hadchak that's so severe that we don't even need a minority opinion?
Well, what I would say is right, that what I argued is that there are positions where it's not that you don't need a minority opinion. It's there is no minority opinion because everybody agrees what the Halakhah is.
Right.
Right.
Okay, so in that case, what happens?
In that case, you can follow, right? Everyone agrees, right? So there's no dispute.
No, I'm sorry. So we know what the halacha is under normal circumstances, right, but this is a very severe Shas Hadchak. Can we ever violate that consensus opinion?
Well, so the answer is we can't violate the consensus opinion, but we can argue that the consensus opinion would be that the halacha should be different in this kind of Shas Hadchak.
Okay.
Right. That's the first case of Rebbe and Rabbi Eliezer, where right of the Chacham and Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says, look, there's this case where the Chachamim accepted my opinion and didn't make her tamei retroactively, and the Chachamim say, "Ein Shas Hadchak raya." No, we did that because we agree that you're right in that kind of circumstance. But that doesn't prove anything about the ordinary circumstance.
But we still need somebody who has that opinion. We
No,
can't
we don't.
have.
We don't. It's just a coincidence that Rabbi Eliezer thinks that position is ordinary in
Oh,
ordinary
okay.
circumstances, right? It might be that Rabbi Eliezer didn't say that. We would still think that.
Okay. Got
Okay.
it.
So let's go back to.
Wait, I have a question.
Yes, Adina.
So is there like but for all of these cases that like the Gemara mentions and that were like in the Ramah and the Bach, it would what is it talking about like also disagreement in like whether the present circumstances are Shaat Hadchak, or it's like everyone agrees and then the question is what to do?
For our circumstances, we're assuming that everyone agrees as to not only that it is a Shaat Hadchak, but as to how severe a Shaat Hadchak is. Right? Obviously, you can complicate this and make it an iterative situation. What happens if I think it's the kind of Shaat Hadchak where everybody should agree, and you think it's the kind of Shaat Hadchak, right? What happens if I think it's a minority opinion, and you think it's not just a minority opinion? The minority is a trivial figure, right? Right. Those are obviously second stage arguments. I'm in my thought experiment here. Everyone agrees about everything, right? All the circumstances, and I'm reaching consensus halacha about how to react in this circumstance. And the consensus,
We also have like rules for a Shaat Hadchak on that like what's considered a communal Shaat Hadchak. That would be like the drought year or the individuals, like if it's Shabbos or whatever.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. And at least so far, people have assumed that the Shaat Hadchak called Hefsed Meruba can exist either communally or individually, and we haven't set up a claim that no, there's a difference between a communal Shaat Hadchak and an individual, and that can accomplish things that an individual Shaat Hadchak, no matter how severe, can't reach. Right? You can imagine such a position, but we haven't seen such a position yet. Okay. Other questions? All right, I'm going to go back to sharing. Okay, so moving on. Here is the right. So I'm going to give you. So I'm going to talk about how right. We've talked about how halacha can change in terms of authority. Now I want to talk about how radically halacha can change. Right. How much difference could there be between what the consensus holds in an ordinary circumstance and what the consensus holds in a Shaat Hadchak? So the Tur sets out a machloket as follows. The Tur says we're dealing with lulav again. Kol hapsulim mach masmum. Each of the four species that are invalid because some kind of flaw in one of the four species. Imhu Shaat Hadchak she'ein nimsa kasher. If we're in a Shaat Hadchak which is defined as we can't find one that is kosher, ksherim v'yachol levarech alehem. So all the things that the Mishnah says are pasul, if it's because of a mum, some flaw in the lulav, the estrog, the hadassah, the rava, if you can't get a kosher one, guess what? You can make a bracha on one that's otherwise pasul. The Ravid katav, but the Ravid wrote, shelo yavarech alehem, that you can't make a bracha on them. Ela yuchazem biado shelo tichachach torat lulav. Ravid says, no, how could you possibly make a bracha on it? It's pasul. Ravid just says, but it's a good idea to have, to do something that's a ritual memory. But it doesn't have, right? You can't say that something that's pasul becomes kasher just because the Shaat Hadchak. But the Rosh, the Tur's father, said, no, I think you make a bracha on it. Okay, and then we'll see that the Rambam seems to create new distinctions. The Rambam says that a dried out lulav is kasher b'Shaat Hadchak, but not a dried out estrog or hadass. So, right, so he seems to split the difference somehow to create a new kind of rule. But the Torah says lo nirab. I don't understand the Maishno Zemizeh, right? The Torah says it seems to me this is an abstract question, right? Do the mumim that invalidate the four minim, do those rules apply b'Shaat Hadchak or not? If you think they apply b'Shaat Hadchak, then they're all pasul, and if you think that they don't apply b'Shaat Hadchak, they're all kasher. Okay, we have to figure out what, right? So we have three positions. We have the Ravid who says general rule: if it's pasul, then you can never make a bracha on it. It's only just going to be some kind of recollection. If you have the Rosh who says no, you can even make a bracha on it, and you have the Rambam who says it depends. Okay, so let's see how the Beis Yosef sets out this machloket. So the Beis Yosef starts off by quoting the Mishnah, then he quotes the Rosh who says Mikan mashma shebishas Hadchak yotzin afilu b'pasul, right, as the Torah said. And he quotes the Ravid, and the Ravid said the Ravid originally agreed with him, but now we get to the language of the Ravid. Right, this is the Rush quoting the Ravid. He says, "V'shuv chazar bo ve'amar." In the end, the Ravid stopped agreeing with me, and he said, "The bein b'shas Hadchak ve'ein shelo b'shas Hadchak ein yotzin bi'avesh klal." You can never fulfill your obligation with a dried out lulav. I'm going to make this a little bigger. The chol heicha de katane pasul. Whenever it says pasul, mashma afilu b'diavad. That means even if it's after the fact. And the Ravid here equates b'diavad and mishas Hadchak. He says, look, if we would tell you, right, if in a circumstance where you accidentally took a dried out lulav, we would tell you got to do it again. It's not, you weren't yotze even b'diavad. Then afilu b'makom Hadchak liyotze. So how can we say it's different just because there are pressured circumstances? Because the Ravid says, how could this be? That in a pressure circumstance, you fulfill the obligation, you can even make a bracha on it. Right? We tell you, go ahead and make a bracha on it. And then we're going to tell you the moment you wake up in the morning and we say, there are no estrogim available, you bring me your dry, or no lulavim available, you bring me your dried out lulav, and I say, yes, make a bracha, fulfill the mitzvah. 10 minutes later, it turns out that a shipment of estrogim just come in, and I say, you got to do it again. How can that be? And how can the same etrog be pasul or kosher? And the Ravid says it makes sense to me. Right, it makes sense to me. Yavish kemesu, a dried out lulav is like if it's dead. So how could you possibly make a bracha on it? Rather, what he says is, but he says it's a good idea to take it in your hands in a shas Hadchak, because in circumstances where you can't fulfill the mitzvah properly, it's a good idea to do something as a memorial so that you'll remember there's such a mitzvah. The Zeush Amarash Ein Shas Hadchak Raya, and he thinks that's what the Chacham say when they say Ein Shas Hadchak Raya mean. They don't mean we agree that's the Halakhah. Rather, Kilomar Shlo Asukein Ela Shlo Tishtachach Mehem Toras Lulav. Okay, so the Ravid rereads that Mishnah. I read it to you in a biased way. It's not that when people say to you Ein Shas Hadchak Raya, so the Ravid, it doesn't mean that there's a consensus position that that's the Shas Hadchak. That is Halakhah in the Shas Hadchak. They just mean that sometimes you can't fulfill the mitzvah, and when you can't fulfill the mitzvah, you have to create substitutes which are not the mitzvah. Okay, right? That's the right. That is the right. That's the position of the Ravid. To which the Rush responds. He says, "V'lashon ein Shas Hadchak Raya, and no morel perish." But he thinks this is a forced reading, that the Ravid's reading is not compelling, because he thinks, look, Rabbi Yehuda brought this proof, and what's Rabbi Yehuda's proof? He thinks that Rabbi Yehuda's proof must be that the Bnei Krachim used to make brachot on it. And right, he thinks the proper reading is that they went all the way, because if they didn't make brachot, Rabbi Yehuda has no proof. Rabbi Yehuda says, look, this must be the halacha. If they didn't make brachot, what kind of proof is that? They would say to him, right? So the Ravid must be wrong. So now the Rush comes up against the Ravid's argument. He says, hang on a sec. But how can you tell me that something is pasul on one hand and kosher on the other? And now we get to the really radical thing is, you might tell me all the other cases where this happens are rabbinic rules. But here, the psul of lulav yavesh, according to most figures, at least on the first day, is a biblical thing. Right? So here's what the Rush says. Ella kol hane psule misaran hakasuv lachachamim. All these invalid rules about the four minim, even though they have the rules of halakha d'oraisa, they have the formal standing of halakha d'oraisa, there are lots of cases where the halakha d'oraita is subject to rabbinic discretion. Misaran hakatuv lachachamim, Scripture gave it over to the rabbis to determine what the standards are for d'oraita law. V'hei mamru, and so what the rabbis decided is, shelo b'shas hadchak afilu b'diavad lo yatsa. If it's not a shas hadchak, then you're not yotze at all. Kidei sheyizaru Yisrael b'mitzvot, because they want the Jews to take the mitzvot seriously. Aval makom hadchak hichshirum, keven sheyafsher banyan acher mavarchin alehem. So the Rush, right, so to speak, bites the bullet, and the Rush says that it's right. The rabbis have absolute discretion. And it's perfectly plausible to say that the consensus halacha is that under ordinary circumstances this is completely invalid, and yet in a Shas Hadchak this is right. This is complete. This is completely valid. Okay, and that's how you see right that the Mordechai writes this. He says, even though we rule that all the four minim are yaveshim, we make a bracha on a lulav and hadas yaveshim mishum delo efshter who Shas Hadchak, right? So the Mordechai says that's what we do in Ashkenaz. All right, and the Rav Yah says the same thing is true about a withered estrog, an estrog that is missing something. Okay, but in the bottom, the Beis Yosef then says, well, there's got to be a boundary here. He says, "V'nir l'dayik." It seems to me that we should make a fine distinction here, a close reading. The Rabbeinu that he wrote Kol Hapsulim Machmas Mum. The Tur wrote that it's only the things that are the four minim that are pasul because there's some kind of flaw in the object. Lafuke me'osam shepsulim mipnei she'enan minam. Right, as opposed to those which are pasul because it's not really an esrog, it's not really a lulav. You can't say that in a Shas Hadchak, the Chachamim said, okay, stop, don't take a palm tree, take an oak tree. That's just ridiculous. Now, those are different, but he says, Hadas Shota, right? There's a plant called Hadas Shota, or Mitzipsifa, that are very close to Hadasim, but not quite Hadasim. Dehanach l'divrei hakol ein not linosam leolam, v'afilu b'Shas Hadchak. Those you can't take ever, even if Shas Hadchak, ki heichid lo leisu l'mitaybehu. Right, so what he says is there's a fine line when you do things for a Shas Hadchak only as a memorial. Right, so, or even when you do things because you're fulfilling the Halakhah, if I tell you, if the Chachamim would say, okay, you took an estrog last year, but this year there are no estrogim, so take a pomegranate, there's no way that when there comes back to being estrogim available, we're ever going to stop people from using pomegranates. And you can't use pomegranates. So therefore, the Chachamim said that that there has to be boundaries to the Chachamim's rule. You can suspend details, but you can't change the species. That's an underlying principle. Although he recognizes, right, that there were people, right? He tells you that it was that you'll see in Reish Mem Bet, you'll see that there were people who here we are. There were people who allowed taking something that wasn't hadas but looked like a hadas, and they made brachos on it because they couldn't even get dried out hadasim in their section of Europe. But the Beis Yosef rejects this, and then he says, "Linyan Masa Nira." It seems to him that the right conclusion is the Chol Hani Psulim, all these species that are invalid, b'Shas Hadchak. If it's a Shas Hadchak, the Tuli Natalinan, you're supposed to take them, but you're not supposed to make a bracha over them. Okay, so let's put all this together now. Here's what the Beis Yosef, I think, is saying. He says there's a fundamental dispute between the Rush and the Ravid. The Ravid thinks that anything which is utterly invalid can't be valid in Shas Hadchak. There's a bright line. If it's utterly invalid in one circumstance, it's not valid in any other circumstance. The Rush says no. Not only rabbinic laws, but even biblical laws, to some extent, are given over to rabbinic discretion, and the rabbis are entitled to say that something is utterly invalid in one circumstance and perfectly valid in another circumstance. But the Beis Yosef then qualifies the Rush, and I think he has a good reading in there, and he says there's got to be some boundary to that. And the boundary, he frames it as a pragmatic boundary, that at some point, saying the Halakhah is this way in Shas Hadchak is non-credible, and nobody will believe that that's not really the Halakhah all the time. So you can't make that kind of change. And I would have framed it a little differently. I think that's probably, in a sense, what he means, which is there's got to be some fundamental integrity to the Halakhah. And so you can't say, right, as Lincoln, get Lincoln, if I call a tail a leg, right, it's not a leg. So I can't call a pomegranate an etrog. Right, so there's some kind of boundary to the discretion, but the boundary is not obviously, right, the boundary is something between a change in an accidental attribute or a change in an essential attribute, as to what rabbinic discretion extends to. Then the Beis Yosef himself says that he thinks that the right solution is to compromise between the rush and the rush and the Ravid, and to say, you know what, we can say that it's possibly a mitzvah, so we'll encourage you to do it, but we can't say you make a bracha on it. Right? That the Beis Yosef thinks. Now he frames this as a mechanical issue, I guess, that he can't decide between the rush and the Ravid, so he ends up with a suffix. So suffix brachot lakel, so you don't make the bracha, but in terms of the mitzvah d'oraisa, you do it. But I think he's actually can be framed as, reaching a very reasonable position that you can only say in a Shas Hadchak, this might be the halacha. You can never say in a Shas Hadchak, this is the halacha, if it's pasul in all other circumstances. There's another position which I'm not sure probably won't have time to get to, so I'll say it outside, which is to say you can make a bracha, but don't think you can make a bracha because it means that we're actually certain that you're Yotze. It's just that brachos are certainly a function of rabbinic discretion. So since brachot are certainly a function of rabbinic discretion, then we allow you to make the bracha, but don't think that means this is necessarily really the halacha. Okay, I'll just show you the same argument playing out here about a Megillah, right? What happens if you don't have a full Megillah? You only have separated scrolls of Megillah, so we call it chumash, right? When Megillah is written in multiple scrolls. So he says, the Torah says, "Ein Megillah kshera, yesh matir lekrota b'chumash." Right? If the Megillah is not kosher, some people say read it out of a Megillah that's written in multiple scrolls, just like Lulav Hayavesh that we say Yosef B'Shas Hadchak. And the Shulchan Aruch, right? The Beis Yosef consistently paskins Karima Tov b'chumash below bracha. You can read it, but you can't make the bracha. The Magen Avram says, but some people, right? Because why? Because some people say they're Yosef B'Shas Hadchak. So that's relying on a minority opinion in a Shas Hadchak. But he says, I'm not willing to rely on a minority opinion to the point of making a bracha. Maybe that depends on how severe the Shas Hadchak is, we saw it. But then the Magen Avram says, but only if if even the Chumashim are done, the Galil, right? They're done as a roll-upable scroll. But you can't use a codex, right? Chumash Shalanu, right? But a codex, right? That L'chulei Alma lo yotze, right? That you certainly couldn't. That you certainly could never write a book, a bound book as opposed to a scrolling book. That you could certainly never use, let alone he doesn't deal with the issue of printing versus non-printing. Okay, and then the Mishnah Berurah says, quotes all that, but then he says, "V'pri megadim katav derui gam bezel likrot below bracha shelo tishtachaf Torah Megillah." So, and the Pri Megadim says, no, you know what? With a bracha, you could, right? Even without a bracha, you might as well do anything because as long as you don't make the bracha, you could even bring a pomegranate.
Right.
Okay, yes, good time to stop for questions. Anyone have questions? Okay, so let's summarize where we are again. So we've now said is that in addition to disputes about which sorts of positions you can rely on, there are disputes about the extent to which you can rely on them. So maybe the minority versus majority opinions are only questions about b'diavad versus the l'chatchila, or where the minority position says this is true l'chatchila. But things that everybody agrees are ordinarily pasul. So there's a dispute about whether you can ever change the standards of halacha absolutely, and say because of these circumstances, everything has to change. The Rush says that within boundaries, as long as you can still say it's the same kind of object, within boundaries, you can change it absolutely and say it was pasul yesterday, it's kosher today because of the Shas Hadchak. The Ravid says you can't do that, right? That's ridiculous. And the Mechaber says you can do it halfway. You can do it, but you can't make a bracha. People argue about the bracha. Now you can see all these things playing out nowadays. There are two kinds of contexts. One kind of context is the Zoom question, and you can see all these sorts of issues playing out. So in terms of, let's say, whether you can be Yotzei the Megillah, so there's a minority. What everybody concedes is a minority position that you can be Yotzei the Megillah. You can be Yotzei the Megillah by some kind of electronic means. So some people said, this circumstance is severe enough that we can rely on a minority position, and because we can rely on that minority position, We can even make brachot, and some people said you can rely on the minority position, but not so far as to make brachot. Some people said that this is not really a minority position because they had a misunderstanding of the technology. So even they would agree that this is not a minority position, and therefore the issue is not whether we can rely on a minority position. The issue is whether we can say that halacha is different now. And yesterday you couldn't be Yotzei a Megillah on Zoom, but now you can be because there's no other way of being Yotzei. Right? And then people argue, is Megillah the kind of circumstance that generates that kind of change? And you might say, well, probably what the Mechaber would have said in such circumstances is that even if you agree that this is the kind of circumstance which justifies extreme measures, you could only justify it to the extent of allowing people to read the Megillah. You couldn't justify it to the extent of allowing brachot. Right? That's a framework for thinking about lots of these issues, right? Right? And I think it's important to understand the difference between, really there are three kinds of circumstances. There are circumstances where or arguments. Some people say we're dealing with is a minority versus a majority position. Right? And that everybody agrees that if we define this as a Shaat of Chak sheyesh bo hefsed merubah, then you're entitled to rely on a minority position. Some people say, but no, this isn't even a minority position because they wouldn't have held that in our circumstances. Or otherwise, way of framing it, they would say is, you're allowed to rely on a minority position only if you think the minority and the majority are equally plausible. But I don't think the minority is plausible here, so this is not a minority versus majority position. When it comes to other issues, right, let's say like forming a virtual minion. So forming a virtual minion, right, everyone agrees that there's no minority position that way. Certainly not in the minority position of people of equal stature. So there the issue becomes, can you rely on extreme figures who are not highly influential? Or can you just say the circumstances are so radically different now that we have to change the halacha? And maybe davening in particular is the worst circumstance for doing that, because maybe the Mechaber says that the one thing you can't do in those kind of circumstances is make brachot. Right? So that's a way of framing the conversations about the use of Zoom. I'll talk about that in much more detail in the Thursday night shir. The other circumstance that I think we have to address is definitions of mikveh. Right? So you've probably read that there are people who have tried to argue for a return to bathtub mikvaot because of the extraordinary circumstances. So you have to first of all debate whether the circumstances are that severe, right? That that ordinary mikvaot are in fact enough of a risk not right, that you really have to think about other kinds of mikveh. I would say that right now we need to have a very careful balance. On the one hand, all the medical opinions that are published state that you can create mikvot in ways that don't create an appreciable risk, at least for people who aren't high risk themselves. On the other hand, I think, and there's a letter from Rafi Astrof of Gush Etzion that I think is very important in this regard. He says, but that doesn't mean that women aren't entitled to say that I don't trust the hygiene of my particular mikveh, and I'm scared, and therefore the normal rules about obligation to go to mikveh are not right, should not apply in these circumstances, and that's very important because of women who are in circumstances where they might be under spousal pressure. Issues like that you shouldn't tell people they have an obligation to go, because a reasonable person might look at their local mikveh and say, I know that it's possible to keep a mikveh safe, but I don't believe this mikveh is safe. Then the question about bathtub mikvot. So I think that first of all we have to decide again, is the circumstance that extreme? Which it seems like right now, to me, the general medical advice doesn't make it anywhere near that extreme. But you could say, well, what about people who are a high risk and they can't go to mikveh? Right? How you deal with situations like that? I think that the question of whether it's a minority opinion or a minor opinion is an issue that has to be litigated. The deeper question is that most of these suggestions, what often happens when people exhume past opinions, is as in the technological issue, right, where you exhume Rav Moshe's not so, exhume, let's say, the Minchat Eliezer about Zoom, so you don't talk about whether they properly understood the science or whether it's different, right? So I've argued, again, I'll talk about it Thursday night, that all the tshuvot that justify being Yotzei electronically are not dealing with any circumstance of digital signal processing. And digital signal processing may completely change the digital signal processing may completely change the environment. It might be all those true that are not applicable. So by the same circumstance, aside from the question, our bathtubs are smaller than older bathtubs, and the vast majority of our bathtubs, it's impossible to immerse yourself completely in, whether because of the total volume of water they contain or simply because they're too shallow. The other, and human beings don't box themselves up that way. The other reality is that municipal water systems are very different in different places and different than the old things. So, for example, right, one of the raging debates about municipal water mikvot in the past were about whether water meters function as kalim, but the vast majority, I think, of municipal water systems now are pumped into holding tanks for processing on the way, and holding tanks are certainly kalim, right? So I think that there's a long, long way. I don't mind people bringing up positions, but the notion that you can take a position from the past and immediately apply it to the present without reinvestigating the circumstances seems to me very problematic. Aside from all the authority issues that we have raised, I'm going to answer Adina's question. Saganat nefashot is not the same necessarily as Shaat Hadchak, because obviously you can violate almost anything in order to save your life. The question is, what happens if we say, well, you could not violate it, right? This is the Gemara's discussion about sukkah. So there seems to have been some decree against making a sukkah. So what they did instead was they made a sukkah with an invalid roof, which, right, because whoever was making the decree was very familiar with the laws of sukkah, would have said, oh, that's okay, that's just a booth, that's not a sukkah. So, so the question is that really a Shaat Hadchak? You know, the Sakanat Nefashot doesn't enter into it. It's just really, I think it's just another circumstance where where you can't fulfill the mitzvah in the ordinary way, because you can't fulfill the mitzvah in the ordinary way. So one reason you can't fulfill the mitzvah in the ordinary way is that Lulavim are not available. Another way is that they'll kill you if you fulfill the mitzvah in the ordinary way, right? So that becomes the same kind of Shaat Hadchak. For Lota say, right, if you're going to die if you don't fulfill the mitzvah, so then there's right, so then you have no choice but to violate the Lota say, as long as it's not one of the big three, which of course is going to, we have to deal with big issues of what the boundaries of the big three are. Okay, I did want to mention one last thing, though we're at the end of our hour. We're not going to have time to do it in depth, but I wanted to take a look at some of these issues we'll address more in depth in the night shiurim. I wanted to address two things. So one is really, it's important to say, one is the Yad Malkiel. That's right. I think I forgot to share again. Let me go back to sharing. So the Yad Malkiel says that the rules about what's considered a Shitat Yachid have changed after the closing of the Talmud. That after the Talmud, every dispute in the Talmud between minorities and majorities has already been settled. Right? That's settled law entirely, and the rule follows the majority in the Talmud, and you can't resurrect minority opinions in the Talmud. Right? So the rules are only about. So this whole discussion is only about post-Talmudic law. Other people will make the same kind of claims about minority opinions not mentioned in the Shulchan Aruch. I don't hold that position, but you should be aware that if we say, right, that it is true, right, that the Gemara uses the boundary between the Gemara uses Yachid v'Rabim as an example of a circumstance where the law has not yet been determined. It's just that we can mechanically quantify it as individual versus multiple, but the law hasn't been determined yet, and people argue at various levels that the law has been determined in the past for us. So you have to decide at what level under what circumstances you decide the law has been determined. I have argued in various contexts that the law is sometimes socially determined. If for 80 years nobody has held that position, even though they held it 80 years ago, and everybody has said that position doesn't count at all, so maybe at a certain point the law is so decided that you can't resurrect that position at all. It's just been completely read out of the tradition. And I think that's possible as well, certainly until some major contemporary figure resurrects it. There's also, right, the last thing I want to show you was the Chelkas Yaakov. This is too extreme for us to do in 30 seconds, but I want to say for the Chelkas Yaakov, and when I post the source sheet, you can look at it yourself later. The Chelkas Yaakov says that there's a difference between a Shaat Hadchak that affects the individual and a Shaat Hadchak that has enormous communal consequences. And he treats us, as worse, to some degree, worse than a famine. Right, when there's a Shas Chag with enormous communal consequences. And what he argues, interestingly enough, right, he's dealing with cases of Igun in the post-Holocaust era, and what he says is, look, there are circumstances where he thinks that the rabbis would have to take the authority unto themselves to annul weddings if there were too many consequences, if the consequences socially were too bad. But then he has a really fascinating claim. He says, maybe you'll tell me, v'im nomar, b'dor yatom kazeh, in an orphan generation like ours, ein la beitin litol oz batzmo, beitin v'koach halazeh latir isur Torah. The beitin does not have the kind of discretion that the Rush was talking about. It doesn't have the, right, certainly not in cases of marriages, maybe not even in cases of lulav. So he says in circumstances where you think the rabbis have less formal authority, in those circumstances, then you have to say that the pressure on us to use our other tools is that much greater. And we have to allow things that would otherwise be b'diavad, because these are situations that really should be solved by formal authority. If we no longer have the formal authority, then we have to use other possibilities as well, because you can't leave the Jewish people in a circumstance where the halakha makes life impossible. So if you can't solve it in a certain sense, by using rabbinic superpowers, then you have to be bolder in your use of ordinary rabbinic powers. And I think that has a lot of truth as well. Okay, are there questions at the end that relate to the shir? And if we finish that, then if anybody wants to stay, I'm going to turn off the recording after I take questions related to the shir. And if anybody wants to stay and talk about the Nida issue specifically, I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, I'll find another context. So first of all, questions related to the content and the structure of the shir. Okay, seems not. I think I go too fast. There really ought to be questions. So I'm going to stop.